Before I introduce our speakers, I would like to acknowledge that Mount Royal University is located in the traditional territories of the Niitsitapi, Blackfoot and the people of the Treaty 7 region in southern Alberta, which includes the Siksika, the Piikani, the Kainai, the Sitana and the Yahe Nakoda. We're situated on land where the Bow River meets the Elbow River, and the traditional Blackfoot name for this place is Mokinsis, which we now call the City of Calgary. The City of Calgary is also home to the Métis Nation of Region 3. Now, to get to our wonderful panellist and moderator this evening. So Sally Haney. Sally is the Chair of Broadcasting, Media Studies and Journalism at Mount Royal. She came to Mount Royal in 2003 after a career as a reporter and editor for CBC Television and Radio. And to quote one of Sally's past students, now an alum, Sally is well regarded and well loved by students and staff who've had the pleasure of interacting with her. Through the years, Sally has encouraged her students to use tact when pulling at the threads of a story, to plan ahead when stitching the fabrics of felt experience with the needle of truth, and to weave such tapestries with dignity and hope through their lives as media makers, journalists, and reporters. So what a review, that's great. And Kyle, so Kyle Napier, our first panellist, graduated from Mount Royal in 2014 with a Bachelor of Communication majoring in journalism. He's gone on to complete his Master's in Communication and Technology from the University of Alberta and is now a doctoral student in Education Policy Studies, Indigenous Peoples Education. He's also teaching a course here at Mount Royal this spring, Digital Storytelling with Indigenous Communities. And welcome, Kyle. Our second panellist is Tomi Ajeli. Tomi graduated in 2017 with her Bachelor of Communication majoring in Public Relations. She's now pursuing her Master's in Public Policy from UCalgary and is the Editor-in-Chief at Afros in the City, a media collective amplifying Black voices in Mokinsis, Calgary. Her work has been published in the Huffington Post, CBC, By Blacks, Avenue Magazine and The Sprawl. Welcome, Tomi. Our last panellist, David Mercer, graduated from Mount Royal in 2000 with a Bachelor of Applied Communication majoring in journalism. He has recently returned to Canada after over 20 years working internationally as a filmmaker and journalist for media outlets such as Al Jazeera, CNN International and the BBC. He currently does freelance work for the CBC and works on independent projects through his production company, Mercer Productions. So let's give them a little round of applause just to welcome everybody here this evening. And I'm going to hand it over to you, Sally, to take it away and introduce tonight. Thank you so much, everybody.
Thank you very much. Well, welcome everyone and welcome panelists. It's so good to see everybody. I feel like, David, you and I might have bumped paths if you were here when they say you were here, because I've been around a while, and I know that I definitely connected with both Kyle and Tomi because I taught both of you. So I love when this happens where time passes and here we are, and you come in, and I always have learned so much from you. And really look forward to continuing to learn from you and your perspectives this evening, so welcome. So with the questions, I really only kind of blocked out about 3 or 4 questions. And really the goal, I'm going to occasionally look down and I'm not surfing Facebook. I'm simply keeping track of the time. And I'm hoping that by about 6:40 latest, I hope we're kind of transitioning into some areas around solutions and where is there hope and what are some things that we're observing and seeing that we might be thinking about replicating and trying. And I think a lot of that is, it's funny, sometimes you talk about hope and optimism and solution and people kind of like scoff and think, how fanciful thinking that is. And yet I think that it's really essential that we get there. But you can't get there until you begin to really map out what is going on. And so I begin with a question about polarization. And I would ask each panelist to respond to this from your vantage point, to really think about where you're positioned. What or who is driving polarization? I'll start with David.
No, thank you. Thanks for starting with me. Well, obviously, I mean, for me, it's the groups that have a vested interest in creating alignment with their belief system. So, you know, let's take here in Canada. If we look at the pandemic or something like that, that's been an incredibly polarizing event. And you've seen all sort of splinter media groups that have started up, that have launched and have gotten a large following through social media, through their accounts, through creating their own media. And, you know, their vested interest is in their own political, social beliefs. So, you know, I think there's certainly, you know, grassroots groups that are driving the polarization at one level, and then, you know, at another level, there would certainly be powerful interest groups that are driving polarization, who would be providing support to some of these grass level groups, who would be interested in gaining support for their beliefs that way as well. Mm-hmm. So, you know, somebody like, I was looking at this book here, Noam Chomsky, right? He talks about that a lot, the powers that are behind the media, whether it's the mainstream media or whether it's alternative media. So, you know, there's individuals who are driving the polarization is what I think, and then we all end up in, you know, our echo chambers where we're listening to the types of media that we tend to align with or that we agree with, and then that just snowballs, I think, the effect again and again.
Thank you. Tommy, do you have anything to add when you think about that question, what or who?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I like that you spoke to the who, because I think about it a lot in terms of the what. And I think for me, I see it a lot as a desire to belong, actually, and perhaps some fear. So fear to live in the messiness that often complex subjects force us to live in, and fear of looking stupid, fear of saying the wrong thing, and fear of sort of losing your citizenship to whatever group that has made you feel so safe, and to whatever group that has made you feel like you belong. And I think also, you know, the digital landscape we live in really sort of algorithmically glorifies drama and controversy. So I think that paired with this sort of desperate desire to find place and then feel validated in where we belong, and our side is saying this, so we're gonna stick with it. I think that really contributes to it as well, along with, you know, everything that David said. Mm-hmm.
So kind of a who and a what. Kyle, do you have anything to add in terms of, again, the who or the what that's driving the polarization that we all feel it? You know, we all feel it.
You follow that, geez. So, well, I really want to start with agreeing with both of your points, both recognizing diffraction as a fundamental catalyst in misunderstanding, but also the sense of belonging and people feeling like they need to belong to a certain group. I mean, that's what drives belief systems and ontologies and worldviews and identities, right? Is a matter of feeling as though you belong to a certain group or a bunch of different groups. So I'd like to bring a drastic example for rhetoric's sake around polarization, which is that in high school I knew a gentleman, his name was Brian, and he introduced me to a few different hip-hop groups, which is great. Several years later, I would see Brian at a neo-Nazi rally. I would be on the side throwing cans at neo-Nazis, and he would be on the receiving end of those cans. So he had transitioned from a Brian that I had known and loved as a you know, kind of funny, cordial, go-lucky guy into someone who had radicalized belief systems. And you know, it's easy to talk about neo-Nazis as a point of radicalization and polarization. It's an easy example, but we all know, and you all know, examples close to home, even relatives that hold positions that are contrast to yours, so divisive that you don't know if you can have that type of conversation at the dinner table. And so what happened with Brian and I is we saw each other, and there was a police with bikes in the way of discourse. We wouldn't be having discourse in front of City Hall in this forum. But I saw Brian, and Brian saw me, and I said, like, hey, let's sit on the stoop here or whatever and talk about things for a second. And the police wouldn't let us. They had the bicycles and whatever, and like, no, we're old friends. We're just gonna talk. And so we did. And so I said, Brian, what happened? right?
Yeah.
This is a pretty easy question to ask in that situation. And then or at least an immediate question, because I hadn't seen him in a number of years. And he said, well, I was alone, and I had no one around me. I had no sense of community. And so to your point of belonging, he had, I would argue, been preyed upon by a group that fictionalizes belonging as a way of radicalizing. And I think that happens, David, to your point of the what of diffraction and where are those sources coming from, is that there are foreign opportunized sources of diffraction that prey on that. And I think there's a human element once we get to the solutions-oriented part of the discussion that really brings people together from that. And that's where Brian and I talked. And I don't think in that forum he changed his opinions that drastically. But I sure hope that he paused and thought. And I hadn't seen Brian since, so my thoughts remain hopeful.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
I love the story, that's one thing with communicators is story is the currency. And I appreciate you bringing the story about you and Brian, and how I hope that you meet again in a positive way. We all come from very different places. We sit here, as does everyone in this audience tonight. I think it would, for me, it would be amiss if we got through this evening's conversation without me asking you, like, what does divisive discourse look like in your life? Like, how has divisive discourse or polarization impacted you? And again, I give you 3 ways or all of them in, if you like. There's personal impacts. There can be professional impacts. There can be spiritual impacts. So I think, choose whatever is really speaking to you in this moment. But Kyle, how does polarization, divisive discourse impact you?
I think it's just a difference in truth and what we agree upon as truth. And so division becomes, we were talking informally about objectivity earlier and what that really means or could mean. And so divisiveness is a disagreement in truth and what you agree as truth, as a fundamental truth that defines your reality and then somebody else's. And so in situations for me where divisiveness has occurred is largely, I would say, around just trying to meet with someone, but knowing that they are not prepared for my version of the truth. So a situation that stories this a bit. And I was the only Indigenous person working on 4 floors, and this is a number of years ago, so I'm sure that person has moved on. But what happened was, we had a bit of a fundraising effort, and on one of the floors, somebody had begun doing like a fake like that going in a circle, and so okay, 5 seconds is a lot. But it went on for several minutes. I left. I went to my desk. Everybody was working, right, was around the celebration. I went to my desk, and I just needed a moment. And I came back several minutes later, and either it had begun again or hadn't stopped. And I was like, wow, that really spiritually affected me. And so now to prepare for situations where I feel as though there might be divisiveness, and not that I was assuming that there would be divisiveness here tonight, but I smudged, and I really thought, and to me, and in my own Indigenous ancestral communication methods, that is a direct line to creator. And I asked for strength. I asked for a source of knowledge that is relatable, right? Something that people here can understand so that I can put forward a truth that you can agree with, right? And what is acceptable and what is not acceptable. And I think that really bridges to the idea of conquering that divisiveness. And so, right, but your question was how does that affect?
Well, I think that this stuff can really hurt.
Yeah.
And it can hurt at an individual level, it can hurt at community level, it hurts globally.
That's right.
When, there's extreme division. So I wanted to know how you'd been impacted. And I think your story really illustrated that perfectly. Tomi, this is a question obviously I'd shared with the team prior, so you had some time to think about it. But how do you come into that question? What's the way that you wish to answer a question like that?
Yeah, I think, Kyle already touched on this in similar ways, where I liked what you said about kind of having to ask, is this person or is this space going to be ready for my truth, and having to worry about how might me presenting my truth and showing up as I am end up in perhaps a demoralizing and potentially dehumanizing experience. If you're in a space where you're sort of forced to kind of justify or validate your own existence. And I think in those kinds of spaces, when I see, whether it's that divisive commentary or how people are carrying themselves, and it's those sort of ideologies are targeted to me and my personhood and my family, I think that is something that really does have a very kind of all-encompassing sort of spiritual effect, where you're kind of thinking, what does safety look like in this world when it comes to just kind of navigating spaces? And so that was kind of the first thought I had. But I think on the other hand, too, I also, intellectually, I think that I'm obviously such a product of today's environment. I really see how divisive discourse is affecting me. I really see it kind of eroding at my personal capacity for compassion. I'm watching it happen, and I pride myself in being able to think critically, and I'm watching that being taken away, honestly, because of the spaces that I'm in, because of what I see. I watch myself react to something, and out of sort of this need to provide a soundbite that shows you exactly where I stand, and that's never been who I wanted to be. That's not how those aren't where my strengths lie. Again, I pride myself in being able to think critically, but I'm watching that sort of, I'm kind of chipping away at that a little bit the more I kind of become a product of this day and age, which is interesting to me to kind of see it in real time. I'm like, oh, I'm getting worse. It sucks.
Oh. David, do you have anything to add to that question? I'd love to hear your sense of, how does this stuff impact you?
Yeah, well, I've got a good example recently of how it impacted me, well, personally and also professionally. So, prior to coming to Calgary, or coming back to Calgary, because I grew up here, when Calgary was a much smaller city, but I always, knew Calgary for being Calgary, for being a very conservative city, in a very conservative province, and I grew up with a lot of conservative kids. And then went off to do my work, and a lot of the stories that I reported on when I was in Latin America, my friends in Latin America, they would have agreed with my treatment of the story and the people who I quoted and the direction the story took, etc. It was often human rights related, social issues, things like that. When I came back to Calgary, I thought, this is going to be interesting because it's a very different environment than I'm in here. And if I want to take on and do some environmental stories, which I did quite a few of when I was in Latin America, mining stories and so forth, where the culprit tended to be, the evil mining companies tended to be Canadian. But that's one thing when I'm in Guatemala or Nicaragua. It's another thing when I'm here in Canada. Anyway, so I was wondering, how am I going to approach environmental stories? And at the same time, I was trying to start a commercial business as well, because the journalism wasn't going to pay the bills. So I wanted to have commercial clients, So I didn't want to upset anybody, right, by my reporting. In any case, an opportunity came up last year to do a story about Tiny House Warriors, who are a group of Indigenous women, First Nations women in British Columbia, who were dead set on stopping the Trans Mountain expansion and setting up their tiny homes along route. So anyway, I'd been speaking to a producer in the States about this. He flew up. I was the camera person. I was camera person producer, but at the same time, he was really the one who was driving the story because it was his story. He came from this organization called AJ Plus. Filmed for 5 days. We came back. He edited it with his team in Washington. They put the story out. He shared it with me. He said, "Can you please share this with all of your network? We'd really like to get the word out." And I watched it and I said, okay, I'm really proud of my camera work, and it certainly tells a point of view, which I think is really important to share with the world. Do I want to share this on my social media pages? I'm not sure if I do, but anyway, so I did. And one of my old friends, one of my best friends when I was in junior high school, saw it, and he publicly on my Facebook, he lambasted me, he insulted me, he accused me of certain things. And I mean, he's trolled me before, and I thought, this is exactly what I was afraid would happen. And he made the presumption that I had been an integral figure in shaping the story in the edit, because that's where the story is really made. And I wasn't. Was I proud of my work? Yes. Do I think it was an important story to tell? Yes. Do I think that it was an objective? We were talking about that word earlier. Was it an objective journalism? No. Does it have to be objective journalism? No. If you're watching an AJ Plus story, do you know what you're getting into? Probably. Mm-hmm. So, at the same time, I lost whatever friendship I had with him. I lost in that moment. I recognized also that I need to be very careful if I want to go out and work for, companies in Calgary. If they see that I was part of that production, then they might not want to hire me because they don't agree with the point of view that story took. So, and it's a divisive issue. It's First Nations, it's land rights, it's oil and gas, it's the environment. It's Ottawa, it's Alberta, and
all the things.
All the things right there, compartmentalized. So,
you mentioned it was a point of view, and I know in journalism teaching, I try to sort of get a journalist to think about being in the middle of a story and really doing a good job of looking at the 360 degrees. So it's very easy to show up at a story and look at this, right? Like, this is what's happening right now. We're talking, and you're there, and you're there, and you're there. But really, to understand the full story, it's really important that we look at the entire circle. And that's really hard to do. And it's really hard to do when you don't have a lot of time. Mm-hmm. But I did want to talk about, that issue of point of view. You also, a couple of you mentioned the word truth. And, people and their beliefs and their truths. And again, in journalism and in communications, generally speaking, we talk a lot about evidence-based storytelling, and truth as facts, which are always contestable, it seems. But I just wondered here, do you have any comment about, the role that redefining truth might play in coming to terms with, again, division and brutal dialogue, actually. Does that? I'm just curious what you think. We seem to have kind of messed up truth, or am I off base? What are your thoughts on that? Any one of you? Yeah.
Yeah, I feel like we need to kind of dethrone evidence a little bit, because I think it's been weaponized. I think it's been used to kind of perpetuate epistemic violence also, and just kind of, this is the process, this is truth, this is evidence. But I also think, more importantly, that it is nothing unless it's mobilized. And I think that it's a kind of an easy way to sort of say, this is evidence-based, this is an evidence-based policy, but that truly doesn't mean anything, because you can have a set of numbers, you can have a story, you can have all of these things, but you have to do something with it, and you have to make meaning from it, and you have to analyze it, and any which way you do that could point you to 100 different solutions. And so I think that there's this idea that we've kind of created that there is some kind of objective truth, and we'll get there by following the evidence. And I think I just don't believe that to be true.
I think what I'm hearing is that instead there are many, many perspectives, and a careful consideration of a multitude of perspectives is likely going to get us further.
Yeah,
perhaps.
And I think that, also if that is true, if we're sitting in this spot of, well, we just follow the evidence, then I see how it can be so difficult for us to talk, because you're like, it's so obvious. And I'm like, it's so obvious, just follow the evidence. And then you're like, just follow the evidence. But if we're coming from this space of there are many different truths and there are many different stories, and we all know, okay, this thing's really complicated, so let's try to talk it out. And I think that is a bit more of an accurate picture of what we're dealing with here than, some sort of evidence-based story or truth.
Right. Kyle.
I'd love to follow that. Yeah, thank you, Tomi. Evidence-based truths led to malnutrition policies in residential schools. Evidence-based policies released Columbus when he was imprisoned from the crown of Castile. He evidenced to the Pope at the time that because these people in Taino-occupied, what we currently refer to as the Caribbean, he said that they're not people because they're not Christian, and he used that evidence. And we're talking about this as journalists, right? It's our job to be purveyors of truth. What we put into print becomes legitimized. And so, prior to, once Columbus was released, they put into print the doctrine of discovery, which would further evidence that if someone was a non-Christian, they were not a person. And that would evidence terra nullius, which said this land was not occupied and therefore open to colonization. So, whether or not we're journalists, we deal with print. We put things into permanence. And that's the challenge. And so just really acknowledging that dethroning evidence. It's so important. I work in several research capacities, both quant and qual and mixed method, and it's so easy to get contrasting evidence based on how you ask questions. It's kind of like evidence is what is changing education policies in Alberta right now, right? People are evidencing that in their own ways, despite what we may, as educators, suggest as unreasonable for K-12 curriculum. And I know we're not supposed to be too detailed about the targets we're picking in divisive discourse, but evidence has, been so structurally misinformed that it has led to drastic consequences. And so, anyway. But back to...
I appreciate that. I mean, I think that's exactly where I was hoping we might land. And before moving on, there is a question, so I'll just wait a moment so that we can hear the question from someone in the audience. So if you can state your name and then direct your question to one of the panelists, that would be great. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Andrea, and my question is for Tomi. So you were talking about the possibility of talking it out when there's some division or some looking for truth. What kind of tools would you suggest if not everyone has the capacity to literally talk it out? How can you have a conversation beyond talking it out?
That's a really good question. I think that, truthfully, I do think that a lot of coming together and a lot of bridging does start individually. I think that even what I was kind of saying earlier about how I see my capacity for compassion just, being chipped away at, I think that we really have to come from a position of asking ourselves, am I in a place to have compassion for this situation and for this person and for their story or for these people. And I think sometimes we're not. And I actually think that's okay. Like, I think if I'm thinking about a group or something that's happening and I'm like, I'm not in that headspace right now, that I have to understand that I am not going to be able to understand. And I think sometimes we do this thing where, or at least I do this thing where I'm kind of like, I honestly just don't get it. I don't get it. And I'm acting as if I'm trying to get it, but I'm clearly so, I'm so kind of cut off or shut down from trying to exercise compassion, because where there's no compassion, there's just no understanding. And I don't think we necessarily, again, have to have compassion for all people in all situations, but I think it's a prerequisite for understanding. And so I think that's a really interesting question of like, yeah, not being able to actually talk it out. But I think for me, if that was the case, I would really just try to start with myself and start internally and say, what would exercising some compassion for this person, for this situation, look like? What would that mean? What kind of sort of truths or stories could I come up with as a defense for this person before even engaging in dialogue? Because it already takes me to the situation of humanity. And like, of course, people don't just do things because they want to be crazy. Like, nobody does that. And so the idea of, can I conceptualize what humanity for this person looks like? I think I'm already so far along in that journey of kind of connecting and understanding. I hope that kind of answers the question.
It's like, kind of sounds like giving yourself permission to not understand and be able to reflect and walk away. So thank you.
Yeah.
Could I just say, in answer to your question, I think, and you touched on it just now, telling stories to yourself, but also storytelling, I think, can be a fantastic tool for trying to, if you were to share a story that you think might reflect that point of view that this person, this friend of yours, or this acquaintance, you want them to try to have compassion for that situation. Whether it's a book or a movie or a magazine article that tells a personal story of somebody, I think storytelling is the way that we can bridge that gap. So, I mean, it can tear us apart, but it can also, and I'm getting ahead of ourselves here, right?
No.
But,
No, I think that's it.
But bring us together. So,
Yeah, it's great.
Yeah.
I mean, Andrea's question actually really does, I think it's a great time to sort of turn into some of the things that we have done, some of the things that we have observed that seem to work quite well with bringing about a more sort of, I'm not a big fan of the word productive, but just meaningful conversation, right? Meaningful dialogue. So I noticed that there is one more question in the audience. Go ahead if you want to say your name and
Sure.
let us know who you'd
Thank
like
you, Sally.
to answer.
And we can decide if you want to move on, that's fine as well.
No, it's okay.
I'm Eleanor, I work at Mount Royal in Alumni Relations. I just actually wanted to go back a bit to the conversation around truth, and this is something that I'm quite curious about. I think that is this idea of having multiple truths or multiple perspectives, and I think that comes from a place of trying to acknowledge different experiences. But I'm also curious about, I guess it's a two-edged sword in terms of some of the stuff we've been talking about with the pandemic and echo chambers and things like that. Is it kind of potentially releases people from feeling they have to find some of what we'll talk about, this common humanity or common sense of this is a shared experience or reality that we're going through together. And I was wondering if you could just speak a bit to that tension, if that's something that you've thought about, or yeah.
Anybody want to take on Eleanor's question? Or is there something in Eleanor's words that we can connect over in order to sort of journey forward?
Sure, yeah, I'll take
Kyle.
Yeah. Jump
Thank
right
you.
in. And Tommy, this builds off your point earlier of connectedness and belonging, is if you notice that someone that you love or that you're connected to is straying into a radicalized perspective or point of view, and you might be losing touch with them, or they perhaps are being preyed upon, right, for that sense of loneliness or belonging or needing to belong. Reach out to them and let them know that you love them, and that will really go a long way and sit with them and talk with them and talk with them honestly and ask them questions and you know, as opposed to asserting your truth and what you feel is right, understand things from their perspective, and perhaps that'll lead to, and this is jumping the gun again, but that at least your understanding of their truth, and then what you might agree on. And I'd really like to bring up a co-author in Indigenous methodologies. This is Dr. Linda Tuhawaii-Smith, who talks about decolonizing methodologies. But another leading author in the space is Dr. Jennifer Wemigwan, who authors a digital bundle, and chapter 4 of a digital bundle is called Debwewin, and that's in Anishinaabemowin, the Anishinaabe language. It means truth, and it's a beautiful chapter. I'm assigning that to our scholars in Journalism 3787, and so it at the crux gets to truth and our role as mediators in truth. And Debwewin, why that word is used for truth is that's the first word that we actually hear, regardless of your language, according to Anishinaabemowin, because that's the sound of your heartbeat, and that's really where truth comes from. And speaking right linguistically, there are a really great way to understand truth is to look to other languages and how those languages define the word truth. And so, but getting back to diffraction, you know, one thing that has been catalyzed in you know, since the Royal Commission on Aboriginal Peoples is the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, and it's very important that they put it in that order, right? Truth before reconciliation, and a lot of you know, industries, institutions, organizations, and so on jump the gun when it comes to reconciliation or claiming reconciliatory effort or indigenizing efforts without confronting those truths. So it's important, like you're saying, that multiplicity of truths is to at least have that understanding. And if there is a system of hurt or disaffection or so on, that at least that can be acknowledged as a truth to be reconciled. Yeah.
Thank you, Kyle, so much. And again, just to continue kind of leaning into this part of the conversation, I would just love to hear more from the panelists about just some personal, you know, experiences you've had or things that you've observed that you really feel are worth learning about or replicating because you think that there's something very tangible there that could help us journey forward. Does anything come up for you? Tomi, you're nodding your head.
I once did, you know, for a piece I was working on, kind of talk to this organization, this kind of feminist arts festival organization, and they had kind of been called out because their mission statement was all about supporting, you know, an intersectional feminism and gender minorities in the arts, and they really weren't making good on that mission statement, and they had kind of some community members call them out on it. And I think, you know, Kyle kind of spoke to this, but I think a lot of organizations and institutions really rush to this reconciliation part, or rush to let's do anti-racism, and like we're ready, you know, let's host a forum and let's figure this out in the 90-minute time slot that we've kind of set for this institution, and let's solve this. And I think that, you know, you can have your forums and you can have your town halls and you can do that, but it kind of goes back to the, you know, the master's tools will never dismantle the master's house. I think that the only time that I've seen it work is when there's a genuine willingness to let it all go. And I think that's really, really scary. And with this organization, FemWave is the name, that's exactly what they did. They came to the table and they said, we're willing to give up everything we've built if it's no longer serving the community that we built it to serve. And they were really ready for it to not exist at all, and ended up continuing on with different leadership, but they were really prepared to have that conversation. And I think sometimes we do have to ask, like, do we want to see change? Do we actually want, or not do we want to see change? Do we want change? Or do we want to be the kind of people who push for change? Because I think a lot of us are the latter. Like we all want to be the kinds of people who are ready to get disruptive. But it can be really, really disruptive. And I think if we want to keep it within the confines of the agenda and, the organizational structure and, can we just like build a committee and then everything will just keep going, I think it's just not going to work. And I think the only time, that was just such an encouraging thing to see, the FemWave example, because they really were ready to just let it all go. They're really ready to just kind of deconstruct the entire thing and either rebuild or just walk away. And I think that takes a lot. I think it's terrifying and something that maybe most people aren't willing to do.
I think you're right. I mean, it requires a complete absence of defensiveness, which seems to be, really present in a lot of our spaces. Thank you so much for that. David or Kyle, can you think of other examples of things that you've observed or that you've been a part of that might be just worth replicating and helping us do this differently as we move forward?
Kyle?
Sure. I mean, yeah. Excuse me. There are a lot of examples, I think, of people who are doing it right. The Berger inquiry comes to mind, of when they were going to run a pipeline through the Northwest Territories, and they reached out to the Indigenous communities of the area, and it was, and I forget his first name, but last name Berger, who would go through the communities and hold, like you're saying, town halls, which aren't necessarily total forums for truth, right? There are exclusive natures to such fora, but in this nature, and in how Berger conducted himself, he was able to represent community opinions accurately so that the people who would be most affected by such a pipeline could express how they would be affected, and caribou migratory patterns and the like. So when it comes to solutions and modeling after groups that are doing it well, that comes to mind. What's so funny about the Truth and Reconciliation Commission is that the original folks involved were actually not involved before the TRC would release the calls to actions. So there would be a filtration process, as so often happens with institutional wants for change, right? And so whether or not we have a solutions forward approach, really it comes down to, is the institution or organization or group of people, whoever, are they ready for it? And it takes time. So like the bodies being discovered this summer by residential schools would really change public opinion around, okay, yeah, truth and reconciliation is something we need to talk about. And those little things like that will change how we interact publicly. What used to be acceptable even to the CP style guide 5 years ago, I mean, they understand drastic changes, even in the 19th, the most recent edition of the style guide, around how they're talking about Indigenous peoples who are living in Canada, right? They in the 18th edition it said, Canada's Aboriginal peoples, and it implied a paternalism, and this time now it's Indigenous peoples living within Canada. And there are major changes that happen, and going back to truth not being static, Eleanor, to your point, is that it really isn't. And what was acceptable in the media in the late 1800s is absolutely terrible and would not make the cut today. And that's just the difference of 100 years. And we really, as participants as participants to the world and the globe, have a responsibility to be actively informed, because the difference in the things that we change, the things that we catalyze today, will have impacts tens and hundreds and thousands of years from now. And so it's really important that we address these truths, that we make changes, and that we decide, okay, what fundamentally needs to happen before things end up being too late. Yeah.
I do. Yes, go ahead.
Yeah.
Yes.
I was thinking of all the reporting that I've done, and there's been so many conflictive stories and so many communities that are that are polarized and so divisive. And I thought of one which is sort of it's being held up as a model to the global community. a number of times. And in the state of Michoacan in Mexico, which is one of the most restive states in all of Mexico, lots of problems with narcos operating there. And there's a group called the Chiran. And it's all about, in the Chiran community, they have managed to create a sustainable economy. They kicked out the police. They have their own policing force. They have their own education system as well that works very well. It's all about consensus building. And it was interesting. We went in there at one point to do some filming with them to show, how they were managing to keep some of these narco groups out. And it was amazing to see what they had done in the community and how the children were educated and they had all these opportunities, and the women were an important, integral part of political decision-making process as well, which is quite rare in Mexico. But at the same time, the efforts that had to be made to make a decision were enormous. And it's hard to replicate that at a larger group level. I mean, even arriving there and saying, can we come and film with you? They had to call a meeting. They had to get 500 people from the community together. We had to present our case to them, what we wanted to do. Everybody had to vote on it, and then there had to be a majority rules. But what they've managed to achieve in a state as in such a sort of deteriorating state as Mexico is in a lot of parts was something really remarkable. So that was definitely a good news story. Sometimes there's very few good news stories out there on a community level, but that was definitely one of them that sticks in my mind. So consensus building and communication and being willing to see other people's points of view, right?
Consensus building takes a lot of time.
A lot of time.
And I feel as though I'm in kind of a new position of leadership in my work, and I do believe in consensus building. It is really hard. The other piece of it is active listening. And I wondered, I thought of, in my own case, over the years, I'll occasionally get, students warring, or a student and a professor have a face-off. And a long time ago, some wise counselor gave me a sheet, and it was really how to facilitate and get people through who are actively fighting. And it was all about active listening, mimicking, like you say something, then I have to mimic back to you what you said. And we don't move on until you say, yes, you heard me. And then the roles are reversed. And you don't even necessarily try to solve the hurt or the conflict. It's really this active listening, which I don't see very much. So I wonder, again, in terms of solutions too, like, do you see, do you do things that really promote consensus, active listening? What works? I think tea works, actually. I think it's very hard to treat people poorly when you give them food and drink. But does anything else come up for you in terms of, that's something that I do or that I've seen done that could be replicated and could be practiced more and taught more? Are there any sorts of those activities that you've been a part of or witnessed in your communities that you're like, that's critical?
I think that what you're saying right there is exactly it, is that spirit of generosity, right? And inviting people into your community or into your home, and treating them with dignity. And I think that, just showing that connection, like you were saying, with that person, that friend of yours who's being radicalized, just saying, I love you, right?
Yeah.
Just something, I care about you. Yeah.
Huge.
It was interesting. Sorry, I was going to say. So in Guatemala, where I lived for 15 years or so of my life, they had a brutal civil war back in the 60s, extended into the 90s. 250,000 people killed or disappeared, and they were going through. I covered numerous trials for genocide, war crimes against former presidents, dictators, and there was still, when I left there, all of the same problems still existed, and even within indigenous communities, because largely it was, the military against a lot of these indigenous communities, scorched earth policies, just wipe out entire villages. And even within the villages, there were people who had been aligned with the military and people who had been, aligned with the guerrillas, and then people who had just been trapped in the middle. And that existed 30 years after the Civil War and after the peace accords were signed. And some people, very intelligent people in Guatemala, pointed out what happened in South Africa. And they said, in South Africa, what we saw the victim and the perpetrator on live national television listening, active listening. The victim would say what happened to their family member who was butchered, and the accused would sit there and listen to it, and actively listen to it. And they said that it was this incredible nationally cathartic process where it allowed people to release some of that anger that they had inside of them, which was something that I never saw happen in Guatemala. I mean, I saw it, there was so much tension just under, you scratch the surface and bam, everything would explode. It was a tinderbox. And it was interesting how they had brought that up and said, this is what we need here, is we need a process where, we can talk to each other. Maybe we can get some, freedom truckers and some, pro-maskers together, and you know what I mean? But just being in the same room and sitting and treating each other as people who were
exactly
on the same planet, right?
Thank you for that, David. Thank you. Kyle, did you have anything to add? I thought maybe you were going to jump in, and then we'll. I can't believe it, but we're getting to be close to.
Yeah. So largely how I inform my own teaching when it comes to contentious topics is from Paulo Freire's Pedagogy of the Oppressed, and he talks about the dialogical dialectic and how how a dialogue is important for teaching, right? It's an understanding of again putting those truths on the table, but when it comes to like you were saying, okay, real conversations need to be had. It's not if right now there's a Russian invasion on Ukrainian territory and a Ukrainian wants to resolve such truths, I don't think that it's necessarily easy for somebody who's protecting their home to suggest, like, hey, let's just stop and talk about this for a second, right, to an invading force. So, and again, it's easy to pick on the brutish ideas, and when the reality is that divisiveness is not always explicit. It's often implicit, or it's buried, or it's hidden, or we don't feel comfortable talking about them. And that's the challenge, right? Is when we don't feel comfortable talking about them, it further amplifies that division. And so what you were talking about, David, where it was a forum, it was televised, and it was that engagement, that co-engagement, that back and forth, that understanding. So what I would suggest is a deplatforming of power for the fora of truth, which is the case that happened there with media using that fora, right, for such an engagement. Now, okay, in the case of Russia and the Ukraine, for instance, perhaps a moderated fora by an international body, I don't know, like the United Nations or some such other, might allow for, perhaps a Russian audience to understand, okay, this is what's happening, or a Ukrainian audience to understand, okay, this is what they're saying in Russia right now, and this is what those people are hearing as truths. And that might make it easier to understand, okay, that's what's motivating them. And once you understand somebody else's motivation, you can get at, okay, what, they are attacking because they think that Ukraine is part of Russia. And, to the Ukrainians' perspective, they would say, well, this is where I'm from. This is my home. This is where I belong, right? This is not Russian territory. And so I think that, for a lot of the soldiers who may have been misinformed, I think that, having a mediated, even guerrilla broadcast, as has been attempted, would really help to shake things up based on national control over what is broadcasted truth.
I appreciate that. Thank you so much. We're almost to the end of our time together. Sometimes in these discussions we can leave and think, ugh, if only I had said, there was something I really needed to say and I didn't get to say it. I had a feeling and I didn't get to express that. So I would ask each of you, and Tomi, maybe I could ask you first, is there something that needs to be said as we close?
Yeah, I'm still thinking about your question. I've been thinking about it this whole time, and I think I just kind of want to go back to that a little bit, because there are often times when we're wrestling with these sort of multiple truths, and we use it kind of like as a scapegoat a little bit. Well, you have your truth, I have mine, and we'll just sort of leave it at that. And I think, at what point then do I get to tell you, like, well, your truth is not truth, it's just a problematic bias, and what gives me the right, and how do we actually make that distinction? And so I've been kind of thinking about that as we're talking, and I think, I liked the term used of sort of deplatforming power, and I think that can really show up in these conversations as well. When we do land in positions of, okay, well, that's your truth, this is mine, I would just say that for those of us who are in positions of privilege, to constantly be calculating and recalculating what has informed my experience and my truth, and in what ways has, my privilege and my access to power informed that. And I think that is really a critical responsibility of people who are in positions of privilege in every conversation, because to end it with, you have your truth and I have mine, without taking that really critical lens to it of like, which truths here have historically been silenced, and what has my truth been informed by, and can that sort of, can we massage that a little bit to then maybe land a bit more of a kind of common truth. So yeah, I think that's the last point I wanted to make.
Love it. Thank you so much. Kyle, David, any last thought, feeling?
Yeah. I really want to break the fourth wall again, I suppose. Yeah, to say that when we had first started talking about this event and co-planning, which became like a facilitatory endeavor, was us deciding on what how the discourse would go. Was initially the conversation had been articulated as a conversation around civil discourse. And it would veer away from that topic of civil discourse. And one thing I'd really like to suggest as a closing statement is that who puts the parameters around civility when it comes to discourse? And when somebody is being reactive to oppression, and they're not reacting in a way that is within the parameters of civility, does that negate their truth or their ability to speak their truth? Perhaps there's a raw honestness that becomes censored because of the parameters of civility. And so that we modified the title of the presentation from where it had been to now. But I just want to leave a note around not being fearful of feral, raw, and honest discourse.
Thank you. David.
I think I'd like to take the opportunity to talk about the role that we play as storytellers. And I think that we play an important role, and I think going back to your question about what we can do if there's somebody who we disagree with, I think that's where storytelling really can come into play. I was thinking about one documentary that I wanted to film that I never got the opportunity to when I was living in the Middle East. And Israel, Palestine was always the most conflictive issue in the Middle East. And I learned about this group called Surfers for Peace. And there was Israeli surfers who would go into Gaza and they would surf with, no, that's not true, actually, sorry, I think I got that wrong. It was the Gazans would get permission to come out. No, that's probably not likely either. Okay, so the Israelis must have gone into Gaza, and there was an American Jew who was going around the world, and he was collecting surfboards, and he would bring them there, and the Gazan and the Palestinians and the Israeli surfers would go together, and they would catch waves in the Mediterranean, right? And I thought, what a fantastic story, right? And you've got these two groups who, they're thousands of years of history has separated them, even though there's so many similarities between the two groups when it comes down to it, whether culturally, religiously, language, everything. And surfing could be the one thing that both sides can have an appreciation for. And I see that as storytellers. Those are the kinds of stories that I think we should be trying to tell more of where you have groups that are on opposing sides who come together over common love for something, and they get to understand each other and get to meet each other as humans who essentially we all have the same, out of all my travels all around the world, as we all know, we all want the same things, right? Essentially. Yeah, we want some happiness, we want some opportunities for our kids if we choose to have kids, and we want some peace and a nice cup of coffee, something like that. So I think that that's what we can do as storytellers, is try to find those stories and try to share those as widely as possible. And so we all just come to have a better understanding of each other's viewpoints, and the fact that there are multiple truths. And we can hold opposing points of view, and that's okay as well.
Well, thank you. I think I will pick up on your story about surfing, and just hopefully we all can sort of figure out how to position ourselves in the water in a way that allows all of us to catch. It doesn't have to be the same wave, but catch a wave, have some fun, speak, hold space for each other, listen, and figure out how to go forward in a way that that doesn't hurt, right? So thank you so much to all of my colleagues here, and it's been a wonderful conversation. Thank you for joining. Thanks for the audience, for you to come out and take your time out of your evening. I hope you found this as informative as I did. Be well.